Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about monetizing AI with Revenium. Today, we will start off by talking a bit about best practice and then move quickly into a hands-on demo. So let's get started. First of all, I'll introduce the speakers for today. My name is Jason Cumberland, and I am the CPO and one of the co-founders of the company. With me today, I have John D'Emic, who is our CTO and another one of our co-founders, and he'll be taking us through the hands-on demo a bit later in the presentation. In today's agenda, I'll start with a brief introduction of the company and what our platform enables, and then talk about the background on best practice and API monetization from the perspective of the companies we're working with. We've analyzed the companies that are growing the most quickly and having the most success and looked at the common characteristics that they're exhibiting, and then also looked at some of the biggest challenge areas and things that are changing, and we'll share that with you so that you can build that into your own plans for monetization as well. When that is done, I will hand off to John, who will take us through our hands-on demo. And then when that's finished, I will do a quick review of the API product analytics that are generated from our demo scenario to give an idea of the types of metrics that you should be tracking in your own business as well. When we're done with that, we'll leave time for a Q&A, and we look forward to that once we're through with everything else. So let's get started. Okay, next we'll provide a bit of a background on Revenium. For those of you that might not know us, prior to this, we were a company called Hypercurrent, and just a couple of weeks ago, we changed our name to give a better indication of what we actually focus on with our clients, which is working with digital products and services that are revenue generating, whether they be directly monetized or not. And we'll explain a bit more about that as we go forward. So there's really two things that Revenium focuses on as a company. The first one is external API and data monetization. And we typically work with medium and large enterprises to help them develop new revenue streams from proprietary data and services. We do that with our low-code SaaS platform that is typically used by business owners because it's relatively simple to use and doesn't involve a lot of code to set up. And they use that to create and manage digital products, develop pricing schemes for API-centric products, and enable paid access to existing or new services that they're developing. On the other side, we work with the same types of companies for their APIs that are indirectly monetized, meaning those that are ultimately very important, but no one pays to use them because they're paying in some other way to consume the service provided by the company. And so for these APIs, as well as the ones that are directly monetized, our platform offers a rich set of API and data analytics that show how the APIs are being used, and also gives engineering leaders a view into the performance of the APIs, the relative performance from one to another, and then gives product owners a set of business analytics that show how API adoption is taking place, abandonment, and different business-centric analytics that are important when offering a digital product. Okay, so next we'll talk about revenue-generating APIs, a bit of an overview on what's happening in the market, as well as best practice from a technical as well as a business perspective as you plan to deliver your own products. First of all, a bit of background. The first statistic comes from McKinsey that was done just in the last year in 2023, and they showed that their clients expect to increase the number of external APIs that they offer by 50% in the next 3 years. So clearly this is an area where there continues to be significant growth, and clients are looking to expand the number of services that can be consumed by customers and partners externally. A more precise statistic on the topic we're talking about today comes from a Postman survey that was also done this year. It was a large survey with thousands of respondents, and they showed that 2/3 of companies were already monetizing their APIs, which is sometimes a surprise to the customers that we work with because I think there's not an awareness that this much of it is already happening today. And then even more impressively, 3/4 of the companies who answered that question in the positive said that over 25% of their total company revenue comes from APIs, which is another pretty shocking amount of revenue for companies who've never considered doing this before and looking at that as a potential revenue stream of that size. It generates a significant opportunity, as is shown in the last box there. And then lastly, over $2 billion of funding was raised by API-first companies in the last 12 months. An API-first company is someone whose product is the API. And so the relevance of that statistics to traditional companies is that there's going to be more and more competition coming in an API-only fashion. And so a lot of the companies we work with today have products that cannot be consumed in an API-only fashion. You have to buy some other product or suite in order to get access to the API. And there's more and more of a customer preference being shown for API-only products, or certainly API products that are included with a traditional product. And in some cases with enterprises, neither of those exist today. And that represents both a threat and an opportunity. And then the second set of data that's along a similar vein comes from a Rapid API survey that was done this year. And this shows another view across industries of the number of companies already monetizing APIs, as well as the growth from year over year, which is the smaller numbers to the right. And so although the data aren't exactly the same as the Postman survey, it's another source that shows there's large-scale adoption of API monetization across a variety of industries. Next, we're going to talk about the key technical considerations as you look to launch a monetized API product. And we'll work our way around this circle from right to left and cover the key areas that we see from working with clients in this space. So the first one is user management, which of course is a concern whether you're monetizing APIs or not. But when you're working in the world of monetized APIs, it's very important to support self-service user registration with as little friction as possible in the process, because developers who are showing up and want to consume the API, you want to convert them on the first time they arrive to make their process of getting access to the API as simple as possible. The second one related to the first is the ability to issue keys that are automatically associated with the level of subscription or the entitlement that has been purchased by the user. And similarly, the ability to automatically expire keys when contracts expire. So oftentimes this requires a new link between a contract management system and the API management system so that there is not manual effort needed to maintain the catalog of API keys and to associate them with the correct level of entitlement, meaning things like the quotas that should be associated with an existing subscription level, or the actual APIs that are included in that subscription, and automatically making those associations and changing over time as the products change over time. So the next two that you see here are SLA management and offer management. In the case of SLA management, it's important when customers are paying for access to your APIs that you can report for them on which transactions met the SLA that you offered, and that could be perhaps from an SLA on latency or performance, meaning the number of transactions that are going to be received successfully versus those that error out. And so it's important that you understand the user experience that you're delivering from the different APIs in your catalog. Next, offer management for API owners and producers. They need the ability to create bundles of APIs, attach pricing and quotas to them, and then publish them automatically into a portal. If this item, number 4, requires interaction between engineering teams and product owning teams every time that something changes, you're going to have 2 very unhappy teams on your hands because it makes things very slow and complex, especially with the number of changes that happen managing commercial offers or custom contracts for clients. And then lastly, we'll go through metering and rating and invoice management. So metering and rating is often thought about to mean I need to count the number of API calls and associate those back to a client. That can be the case, but it's less commonly the case going forward. If you think about the ChatGPT usage model, which most people are familiar with, they are not charging simply based on the number of calls. They're charging based on a conversion of usage into a token. And the more complex the call that you make, the more tokens that you consume in that transaction. And that's commonly being adopted in other API products as well, where customers are extracting data from the API request or the API response headers, or maybe something in the body that will actually indicate the level of usage that was required from that API call, and they'll transform that usage into a price that is charged to the user. And so that makes the metering and rating much more complex than it is in a world where you're just counting API calls. And as the space becomes more competitive, you'll often be pushed into doing something like that as opposed to just having a simple API call-based pricing model. And then lastly, being able to translate the information for number 5 into invoices that are easily consumable by your clients, not just creating the invoice, but synchronizing that back to the ERP, which is oftentimes the trickiest part. And then lastly, making a link between number 6 and number 2, which is the ability to know that when an invoice hasn't been paid after a set amount of time, that you may want to take automatic action on an API access key. And for example, deny access to that key until something is paid, or trigger a manual process where a salesperson or a customer success person reaches out to the customer to request payment before the key is turned off. Next, we're going to go through the customer expectations from revenue generating APIs. And this is something that's changing quite rapidly as paid APIs become more prevalent. So we'll first talk a bit about how things are commonly viewed on the left side then versus the trend and the best practice that's evolving now. So probably for as long as all of you have been working with APIs, you've heard that developers are the new customer. And we still agree, they are a very important customer. But in more and more cases, the developers become the users, and there's a new role where companies or business people are the buyers. And the important thing to realize here when you're developing your plan for monetizing APIs is that means that when someone lands on your developer portal or your commerce portal, if those are different things, that they need to have a different path laid out for them to see the business benefits of the API, whereas the developers still want to go in and see how the APIs are consumed and used, more of a traditional developer portal function. And there needs to be a way for a purchaser to buy access to an API and then easily invite their developer users to consume under that access. And if that is all done manually, which is commonly the way it has been done up until now, it creates a very, very high friction buying process that does not lead to rapid scale. And that leads into the next one that we're talking about here, is that API monetization commonly has been managed by engineers to perform some of the tasks like I just went through. And in the companies that we see that are scaling the most rapidly, it is a business initiative managed by API product managers, where the platforms to support the business are set up by engineering in the beginning, and then they're turned over to the business to manage going forward. This reduces friction in the selling process as well as in the product creation process. It's not uncommon for us to talk to enterprises where they tell us that the process to deliver a new digital product takes somewhere between 9 and 15 months. And in this new competitive world of APIs as products, that is not nearly fast enough to scale and gain market share. Which leads us very into the next one, which is related to the last one. As you move from a world where companies might provision 2 or 3 API keys a month into one where they're hopefully provisioning several API keys a day, you cannot rely on manual provisioning and emails from one group to another to say, we've signed a new customer and now we need to provision an API key with these entitlements. Instead, like we talked about in the technical consideration, that all needs to happen automatically, where there's a linkage between the contract that was signed and the entitlements it contains and the API keys that are issued, and all that needs to be able to happen within minutes, not within weeks or months. And then lastly, and the one that's really driving everything up until now, is that monetization projects are no longer side projects with small revenue tied to them. They're now seeing material customer adoption, retention, and revenue driven out of these products. And that's the exciting part. We saw from the Postman survey earlier how 2/3 of the company already doing this were generating significant revenue from their APIs. And that's the opportunity that's presented to you as you consider moving forward with a product like this in the future as well. And now I'm going to hand things over to John for a demo of Revenium in action. Okay, take it away, John.
Thanks, Jason. Now let's walk through a hands-on demo where we'll show how a proprietary financial services large language model can be productized and monetized as an API using Revenium and Gravitee. For this particular demonstration, we'll consider an imaginary fintech startup called InvestNest. InvestNest currently has a suite of different APIs that it offers for its consumers. And it's in the middle of introducing a new API called MarketMuse, which uses a locally hosted Llama model augmented by real-time financial services data stored in a vector database. So in the context of this demonstration, it'll be something called ChromaDB. This API allows consuming applications to query it for market insights across a variety of financial instruments. MarketMuse's product manager wants to be able to adjust the price of the API query based on the amount of tokens that the large language model has processed. This is a requirement because this will let her manage her cloud GPU costs based on the amount of cloud GPU utilization a particular consumer application is exercising against the API and subsequently the large language model. To facilitate this, the MarketMuse API implementation returns a response header called X tokens consumed, containing the number of tokens consumed by the LLM processing the particular query. In addition to the technical requirements around serving the large language model, there are also business considerations that the product manager also needs to consider. So in order to provide this service, InvestNest needs to support different target markets that they're going after in terms of selling access to the API. And then for the purposes of what we'll walk through today, we'll consider a developer offering, a small and medium-sized business offering, as well as an enterprise offering. Obviously, for this use case, InvestNest needs the ability to collect payments from its different customers for the API utilization. So in the context of a developer offering, InvestNest wants to allow developers to use either a personal or corporate credit card to procure access to the API. And in this scenario, they're using Stripe they want to use Stripe to process those payments. For the SMB and enterprise offering, this needs to be integrated with their Oracle ERP system because these transactions will be larger and probably not credit card based, so generally out of the scope of something like Stripe. In addition to the payment collection, some other considerations that InvestNest is facing is they want the ability for their product management teams to control how the product information is displayed on their commerce portal. So this allows their potential customers to discover the APIs and then, hopefully pay and procure access to them. And then finally, there's a variety of notifications that InvestNest needs to consider for people signing up for their API offerings. So obvious ones are things like invoice emails. So, depending on the settlement period of a particular API product, they need the ability to send invoice PDFs as well as receipts to different customers. They also need the ability to notify their customers if they're approaching any kind of threshold in terms of the license they've agreed to when they've signed up for access for the productized API. And then on the other side of the equation, for their own teams, their sales teams may want to know if a particular customer is at quota because this could be an opportunity for an upsell. Then also their product management teams want notifications via Slack when things like SLAs are violated for their enterprise and SMB offerings. Okay, now let's jump into the Revenium and Gravitee platforms and see how we can monetize the MarketMuse API. So we'll start by going to the Manage Assets component in the Revenium platform. So we can see the different API assets that are in InvestNest's API portfolio. So considering the MarketMuse API, which we've been discussing, we'll drill into this and we can see that obviously its name is called MarketMuse. The asset type is an API. So Revenium supports multiple kinds of assets that can be monetized. So in the context of this demo, this is going to be an API that we're monetizing, but we also have the ability to monetize individual resources within an API. So essentially monetizing different verbs like get versus posts versus puts differently. And then we also support monetization of assets in data lakes like Snowflake. And then finally, we have support for event streams and event-driven APIs as well for monetization. In terms of the resource field here, so this is how Revenium matches API traffic to a particular asset. So for the case of this demonstration, we're using a simple equals classification pattern that will match any API request that contains MarketMuse in the API or the API URL. But we also support more sophisticated classification patterns to do things like look for particular strings within a URL or use a regular expression to determine which API calls match to a particular asset. The regular expression is particularly useful if you wanted to match API traffic based on things like query parameters to price different sorts of API transactions differently depending on which path is paced by a consuming application. The version here is obviously set to 1.0.0. And then finally, we have the assets description. So this is the description of the API asset that will be displayed on a commerce portal for a potential consumer to get more information about the particular API. Okay, now let's jump over and see how products are configured in Revenium. So you can see here that InvestNest has 3 API product offerings. One is called, they're all called FinFusion. There's one called FinFusion Starter API Suite. So this is targeting developers who are signing up via their self-service commerce portal with presumably their either corporate or personal credit card. The next offering is FinFusion Small and Medium-Sized Business Suite. And then the final offering is FinFusion's Enterprise API Suite. So let's jump into the FinFusion Starter API Suite first and see how this has been configured. So if we look at the product details here, we have the name and the product version. Next, we have the pricing model. So Revenium supports a number of different pricing models to price API transactions differently. So for the context of self-service sign-up, there's a volume-based pricing suite. So this incurs a $50 flat rate charge on the client's credit card, and then it gives them access to 2 tiers of consumption, which are progressive. So the first tier gives them 100,000 transactions at a cost of 5 cents per transaction. And then the second tier, once they go over the 100,000, drops their price to 2 cents a transaction. Now, if you recall from the beginning part of our conversation, these 5 and 2 cent numbers are going to be base prices for the API calls. And we can see if I go down here that we have a pricing rule which will scale the price of the API based on the amount of tokens processed by the large language model. And I'll jump in and show you how this pricing rule is defined in a little bit. And we could also see, per the previous part of our conversation, that we want the starter API suite to accept credit card payments. So we have 2 payment configurations that are configured in Revenium. One is InvestNet Stripe production instance, and then we also have an invoice-only payment configuration, which is for the Oracle ERP integration. But again, for the context of this particular product, we're using Stripe, so we have InvestNet Stripe's production payment configuration selected. And now we can see here that we have 2 assets associated with this particular product. So you'll note that for the starter offering, InvestNest has chosen to only give access to MarketMuse and MortgageMine APIs. The other 3 APIs are part of their full API suite and are only part of the SMB and enterprise offerings. Okay, so now let's look into the SMB suite. So for the SMB suite, the pricing model here is transactional. So the transactional pricing model means there's no recurring fee for use of the API, and it's purely based on consumption. For the SMB suite, the base transaction amount is a penny. And then we're also scaling the transactional cost based on the amount of tokens consumed. And then we can see here that the payment configuration for this product is invoice only because this is going to be hitting the Oracle ERP system for payment collection. And we can see here that this has the full suite of InvestNest APIs access associated with it. And then this also has an SLA definition. So because the pricing for this API is higher and the potentially higher, and then the target segment are small and medium-sized businesses, InvestNest has chosen to adhere to SLAs around the latency of the large language model in terms of how long it takes to respond to queries, as well as the response codes. And then in the event that either of those are violated, then there's the ability for InvestNest to offer a refund to a particular client who was impacted by an SLA violation. And then we could also see that this particular product has been published to a commerce portal. We'll drill into this more in a second, but InvestNest has chosen to publish their self-service offering as well as the SMB offering to their commerce portal. Their enterprise offering is not published because that presumes an offline contract where there's been some sort of negotiation with a sales rep because the enterprise price point is a lot higher compared to the self-service and the developer and the SMB tier. And then we can see down here we have the description of the product. So similar to the assets description, this markdown will be automatically surfaced in a commerce portal for developers to get more information about the API and how it's consumed. Okay, now let's switch over to product licenses and see how organizations are granted entitlements for access to a product being managed by Revenium. So we can see here that these are the different product licenses for InvestNest customers that have been procured access. So for the context of the remainder of this demo, we're going to look at Continental Consulting's SMB license that has been issued to their organization to access InvestNest's APIs. And then in particular, the MarketMuse API, which we're going to see metered through Gravitee shortly. So a product license is essentially an entitlement for an organization to use a particular group of APIs. So if I drill into this, we can see that there's a description, the consuming organization set to Continental Consulting, and then we've associated the ThinFusion SMB suite with this product. Also know that there's two consumer applications that are associated with this license. We'll look at this momentarily, but consumer applications are different downstream applications that Continental Consulting is using to access the InvestNest APIs. So if I switch over to the consumer applications component here, we can see the different consuming applications associated with the different product licenses that have procured access to InvestNest's APIs product. So if we look at the two for Continental Consulting, so they have one application called Consult Cash Central. So Consult Cash Central is associated again with the product license we just looked at. And then you also notice that the Consult Cash Central consuming application has an external API key associated with it. In the context of Gravitee, this maps to a client ID. So as transactions go through a Gravitee API gateway, the Revenium Gravitee plugin will use the client ID to identify the particular consumer for Revenium to meter and ultimately bill the API utilization. And then we can also see that Continental Consulting has a second application called Secure Settle Stream that has a different external ID or client ID, which is also consuming the SMB suite. But regardless, both consuming applications are associated with the same product license. Okay, now let's check out the custom pricing rule we've defined that scales the API transaction costs by the amount of tokens processed by the large language model. So if I go to the pricing rules component here, that you can see that there's a single pricing rule called consume token pricing. If I drill into this, we can see there's the Revenium scripting language, so the RSL script that we've written that takes the metadata from the API transaction metadata sent by the Revenium Gravitee policy, which maps to the custom header that the LLM API is returning, and then we're scaling that by the product-based cost. So if I go and test this rule here using the test data that's been defined, we can see that this particular query with mock data has a $333 cost associated with the particular transaction. Okay, now let's switch gears and see how the Revenium metering policy is configured on the Gravitee API management platform. Now we're looking at the MarketMuse API configured on the Gravitee platform. As you can see, we have the Revenium metering plugin applied to the request and the response phases for this particular API proxy. The configuration for the Revenium policy is really straightforward. So it needs to be configured on the request and the response phases like we're seeing here. The configuration itself is trivial. So essentially, there's two fields that are configured for this particular implementation. So this actually is the default. So this is our metering API URL. And then there's the Revenium API key. So this is the API key that we issue to our clients so they can access our API. And this is the entirety of the request metering configuration. If we flip over to the response metering configuration, again, the configuration is identical. So the same URL, the same API key. The difference now is that we're using a Gravitee expression to extract out the X tokens consumed header from the backend API's response. And this is what's essentially propagated to the Revenium platform and then processed by the pricing rule you just saw. So now let's flip back over to the Revenium platform and check and see if our transactions are being metered correctly. Now, if we look at the product transaction log in Revenium, we can see that Continental Consulting's Consult Cash Central application has accessed the Market Muse API, and then the pricing rule has been executed. So you can see that there has been 6 tokens processed. And if you recall, the base cost for this particular product was 5 cents a token. So you can see we have the 30-cent value that was what's ultimately being charged to the consumer. And then if I look at the charge calculation log, we can confirm that the consumed token pricing rule has been executed. So now that you've seen how a proprietary large language model can be exposed via an API with Revenium and Gravitee, and both productized and monetized, I'll hand it back over to Jason to give you a tour of Revenium's analytics capabilities.
All right, in the next section, we're going to review some of the product analytics that you can generate out of, or you should be able to generate out of your digital products that you publish for sale. Okay, now we're going to take a quick review of the different types of analytics that are available for our digital products. From the dashboard view, we'll get a high-level overview of the revenue for the month, as well as how it compares to prior periods and our top products and top customers. As we scroll down the page, you'll get more detailed information about each of those areas. And you'll be able to continue to go down and drill down into these as you see fit. So here, for example, we see the top assets being consumed by different end users. And there's more information like that as we go down the page. I've gone ahead and preloaded some of the information I wanted to focus on in different tabs, and I'll go through that quickly. We'll first start in the section around API analytics. API analytics is the section that will provide operational information about the performance of your APIs to help you understand the experience that the end user is having consuming the APIs. And so we see we've preloaded here a report that shows the number of failed or percentage of failed requests by end user organization. We can change that and look at that view by API, looking here, and then you can go through and see the different types of filters that you can do for each of the areas that you might want to look at. And then the additional information that you can see is just simple usage information for each of the organizations or for each of the APIs, and this is done over the last hour in this case, but then you can also do the different periods that are shown here. And the additional information here, you can also look at things like latency by endpoint or by customer. They'll help you pinpoint on customers that may be having issues or APIs that may be having issues. So that's the operational or API analytics section. Next, we're going to drill down into each of these areas in the product analytics section, which is a bit more advanced user level analytics to show how the products that are being monetized are being used. So here we can see the number of customers that are subscribed to each of our products today. So in this case of this demo, it's fairly simple, but if you had, for every product you have, you can see the number of consumers that are subscribed to it, and then the amount of requests that are being done by each of your end user customers. And then like we showed on the front page, there's a repeat of that report we saw earlier. Next, we're going to look at a type of report that shows you the time to value from the time a user is granted a credential until the time that they make their first call. And this helps your API product managers see the relative effectiveness of the documentation and onboarding process for each of the APIs. So here we have one product that takes about a day and a half and another one that's taking just a number of minutes for the first call to occur. And then the information that's down here in detail for each of the periods as well as the products that you offer. Next, we can look at API product adoption from a slightly different perspective, which is how many of the credentials we hand out actually end up being used. So the last page was how long does it take for them to be used, and this is percentage of those that are used. And this is also useful for product managers who are trying to optimize conversions from credentials that are granted. Next, you can look at API user reporting by period. And I think I have a better usage of this graph here, yes. So I have one that's got a bit more data in it here, where you can look at weeks, days, or months over time and see the number of users that are using your product and how that's trending over time. And then lastly, to drill down specifically into new users and look at new users between a specific period of time and see how much usage is generated in total. This is often used to correlate usage with things like marketing campaigns or ad revenue spend to see how that's translating into new usage over time so that you, as an API product manager, have a complete view of your API estate. And then lastly, often used by customer success teams, we can drill into specific usage by individual customers or by all customers and see how that's trending over time. And that's what we see here in this graph. And then that was all companies. We can also go down into individual user levels and see the same type of data. So that's a quick run through of the type of analytics that would be available to you in terms of best practice when running a digital product portfolio. We hope that it was helpful. And now it's time for questions. So while we're waiting for the questions to come in, we'll just put up our last slide here. If anyone is interested in connecting your existing APIs to our analytics platform, whether you're ready to monetize today or sometime in the future, you can take advantage of all the analytics we showed today for internal or externally used APIs. You can use the QR code there to sign up. And we look forward to the questions.